Hello friends. So last week I made a video denouncing Bill C-10. Bill C-10 is a piece of legislation that has been proposed by Justin Trudeau's administration up here in Canada. It would give a government body known as the CRTC unprecedented new powers over streaming media websites like YouTube. While the specifics of these powers are still unknown, and frankly often seem to be changing by the day, broadly speaking, the plan is to give the CRTC the power to alter the discoverability of content on YouTube, all in the name of steering viewers towards creators who the government thinks more Canadians should be watching. There have also been suggestions that large Canadian YouTube channels may face special regulation and pay new taxes as well. Now, there has been a ton of backlash to this proposed law, which has been widely condemned in all of the newspapers as being a severe infringement on free speech. But there are some people who support it, such as the wonderfully euphemistically named Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, which is a registered lobby group that pushes for more government control over Canadian media. There are a lot of content creators in this country who are heavily dependent on government subsidies, and Friends of Canadian Broadcasting professes to speak for them. They are also a fairly anti-American group that wants it to be harder for Canadians to consume American media. But rather than just sit here and strawman them any further, I thought it would be interesting to show you some of the arguments that this special interest group is making in favor of Bill C-10, and why I think their arguments are hugely unpersuasive. So this is Daniel Bernhard, who is the current head of Friends of Canadian Broadcasting and one of the leading public advocates of Bill C-10. He testified in favor of it on Capitol Hill and has been pushing for it on TV and in the newspapers. And he recently made a YouTube video called The Truth About Bill C-10. It currently has all of 60 views, so let's do him a favor and give his arguments a bit more exposure. So here's what Daniel has to say about the bill's proposed regulation of streaming media companies.
Everybody assumes that regulation or the possibility of regulation means the thought police. And this is just completely made up. Bill C-10 doesn't say how these companies will be regulated, just that they can be regulated. And the most likely thing that will happen is that the CRTC will ask them to pay into a fund to support Canadian content, or maybe ask YouTube to have a little section on the front of their website giving people the option to see what's going on from new Canadian creators, for example. But the CRTC does not regulate what people say on television. They never have, and they never will.
I'll just put aside the whole issue of whether or not tech companies should be taxed to support struggling creators, because I think that's kind of a whole other issue. Instead, I want to talk about this idea of YouTube being forced to display what Daniel calls a little section of government recommended content. None of us really know for sure just how little this section would be. But what we do know is that control over YouTube's discoverability functions, including the infamous YouTube algorithm, is something the government has been very clear about wanting. The draft version of Bill C-10 explicitly used the term discoverability as one of the things it was seeking to control, as well as the presentation of programs for selection by the public, and the proportion of programs to be broadcast that shall be Canadian programs. And the whole purpose of seeking such powers is to steer Canadian YouTube users towards particular content that the government thinks they should be watching. That is good, patriotic Canadian content. The CRTC currently has these powers over TV and radio, and we've been able to see how far they've been willing to go on these platforms. 35% of all Canadian radio airtime has to be spent broadcasting good, patriotic Canadian music, while Canadian TV stations currently have to devote 50% of their primetime programming to good, patriotic Canadian TV shows. So I would say there is plenty of reason to believe that if the CRTC takes control of YouTube, there will be more than just a little section of government-mandated content. Which then begs another question: what will Canadian creators have to do to get their content boosted by this new system? What sort of content will you have to produce to qualify for favorable promotion by this new pro-Canadian patriotism algorithm? Government will have to outline some sort of objective criteria for the sort of content that they consider to be good for Canada, which will then incentivize Canadian YouTube creators to make content that they know will please their government rather than appeal to a broad audience. So in that sense, yes, at that point, government is in fact regulating what creators say, because the government is saying that you can either dance to our tune and get promoted, or just do your own thing and risk getting buried. To me, that is textbook government manipulation of media. Next, let us hear Daniel attempt to flip the script somewhat and reflect the accusations of critics back against them.
Facebook, YouTube, these companies are already censoring your speech, but there are no rules to govern them. The CRTC could, in theory, use these powers to actually to put limits on Google and Facebook for how they limit people's speech and how they govern that speech. That is just as possible, and yet nobody entertains that idea or even that possibility.
Now, obviously, it is true that YouTube's own corporate censorship policies are the stuff of great controversy in their own right. And it is theoretically possible that if you gave government control over YouTube, they could theoretically force them to be more pro-free speech than they currently are. But that is very clearly not the argument that is motivating Bill C-10. And so this strikes me as an incredibly disingenuous argument to be making. And that becomes clear in Daniel's very next sentence, where he starts using sensationalistic rhetoric to denounce people that care too much about free expression.
So I think it's a very regrettable discussion by militants with a very specific ideology about how the internet should look like, that it should be a First Amendment American style, anything goes kind of place. And they are, preying on little details that individual people should not, be expected to fully understand. And so because of all of this uproar, all of this tempest in a teapot, this faux debate about free expression, these very sensible regulations on the companies, not the users, on the companies, are being held up. And that's exactly what these, internet anarchists want. They want an internet where companies like Google and Facebook can do whatever they please in the American style. And that's something that Friends will always militate against.
So I want to focus on something very specific he said here, because it has been one of the big talking points of this bill's defenders. Daniel talks about
very sensible regulations on the companies, not the users, on the companies.
This distinction also came up in an interview that the Canadian Heritage Minister did on CTV the other day.
All that we're asking these companies to do is to make it easily more accessible for Canadians to discover our Canadian artists, our Indigenous artists, our Francophone artists. But people will be able to continue. They'll be free to watch what they want to watch. This is not going to change.
But do you understand? If the CRTC is regulating discoverability of Canadian content on social media, that is regulating social media. You are now calling user-generated content programming, and so it's subjective. Like, this is the fundamental debate. I feel like we're driving past each other here. If the CRTC can put that, you're regulating it.
You have, as I said, individuals are exempt from this law, or will be once it's adopted.
But as far as I'm concerned, attempting to reframe the debate in this way is a complete red herring. The legislation can grant whatever protections it wants to users, but this will be completely irrelevant so long as companies like YouTube are forced to do specific things with user-generated content. You can think of it like television. In theory, I can make any TV show I want right here in my living room, but I still have to get a TV station somewhere to air it if I want people to see it. And since, as we discussed, what Canadian TV stations are allowed to broadcast is regulated by the government, my TV show would be regulated by proxy. Because YouTube creators rely on YouTube, the company, as their platform to broadcast their content to the world, users and platforms are locked in a very tight symbiotic relationship in which you cannot regulate one without the other. This is particularly worth remembering when we listen to Daniel's closing comments.
So where do we go from here? I think we just need to get back to common sense. We need to get back to the text of the bill. And if there are concerns about free expression, let's address them. Let's clarify them. Let's make sure that we say unequivocally that the CRTC can never regulate the individual speech of individual Canadians. In fact, we should adopt an amendment proposed by the Conservative Party, which said that these regulations will only apply to companies, not individuals, to companies with revenues in Canada of over $250 million. That was the Conservative Party's proposition. I think it is a very sensible proposition that clears the air and clears any misconceptions and makes it very clear that this would only apply to mega companies and their activities, not the actions of users.
Again, I really see this whole companies, not individuals business as an irrelevant distraction, which is why I think Daniel is so eager to offer it up as a sort of phony compromise. I don't think the Conservative Party really understands what they're doing with the amendment he's talking about, and it is precisely because it is so ill-conceived that supporters of the legislation and its goals feel so unthreatened by it. Again, you cannot regulate a company in this way without also regulating a user. I mean, by definition, you cannot even be a user of anything unless some company is giving you a platform to use. Freedom to create or freedom to upload are useless rights if your freedom to publish and broadcast will be censored. Really, the only amendment that would alleviate the concerns of somebody like me would have to go something like, no internet media platform shall be obligated by any government entity to publish, promote, depress, favor, disfavor, or otherwise treat differently any uploaded content on the basis of its themes, ideas, messages, national origin, or creator identity, which would then basically destroy the entire necessity of the bill in the first place. So if my amendment sounds good to you, you should really just oppose the bill. So in conclusion, once again, if you have problems with this piece of legislation, please do what you can to raise your concerns on social media in a way that important people will be able to see. I would also recommend that if you subscribe to other Canadian creators on YouTube, please pester them to express their opinion on Bill C-10 as well. This is a bill that explicitly targets Canadians who use YouTube, so I think it's important that Canadian YouTube creators understand what is being proposed here and are inspired to use their platforms to speak out. This legislation has been very heavily puppeteered by special interests from the beginning. Slick lobbyists, like Friends of Canadian Broadcasting, who represent the interests of government-financed media over creators who are proud to make content for the public that is free of government control. Keep YouTube free in Canada. Stop Bill C-10.